There's this moment in every empath's life where they stop feeling the world the way they used to. They stop rushing to rescue, stop explaining, stop reaching for the person who's already halfway out the door. And if you've ever been that person, the one who feels everything, carries everyone, and forgives endlessly, then you know what I mean when I say one day your system just stops. Not out of cruelty, not out of coldness, but because it can't keep bleeding empathy into spaces that don't receive it. That's what I call the freeze. The silent storm inside the super empath. What looks like detachment on the outside is actually a deep nervous system recalibration on the inside. The body, the mind, the heart, they all conspire together to say enough. We need peace now. The empath's freeze isn't an emotional shutdown. It's a sacred act of preservation. You see, when someone has been emotionally available for too long, too forgiving, too open, too accommodating, the mind eventually recognizes that the cost of constant giving is self-erasure. And so it initiates a quiet revolution. The freeze is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's the psyche's way of saying, you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you can't keep pouring into one with a hole in it. And now, let's look at the psychology behind it. When an empath feels emotionally unsafe, when their feelings are invalidated, minimized, or dismissed, their nervous system starts to respond. At first, they'll overfunction. They'll talk, explain, analyze, love harder, text more, try to fix the emotional distance. That's their fight response, not in anger, but in effort. But when that doesn't work, and when that pattern repeats, the body shifts gears. The nervous system flips into freeze mode, a biological response that's often mistaken for apathy. But here's the truth: freeze is not the absence of feeling. It's the overwhelming presence of too much feeling contained. It's the emotional equivalent of the body holding its breath. And in that stillness, something remarkable happens. Clarity starts to emerge, because when the empath finally stops reacting, the noise fades. And when the noise fades, truth speaks. You start to see what was really happening all along, not just who they were, but who you've been while trying to hold them. You realize how much of your identity was wrapped around emotional caretaking, how much of your worth was built on being the safe one, the understanding one. And this realization hurts deeply, because the empath's freeze often feels like a betrayal of their own nature. They ask themselves, why can't I feel the same love anymore? Why do I feel numb? But that numbness is not the end of empathy. It's the beginning of discernment. It's the moment where you stop confusing love with sacrifice. Philosophically speaking, the freeze is an initiation into sovereignty. It's the soul saying, you can love without losing yourself. You can care without collapsing. It's a movement away from codependent compassion into conscious compassion. You start to understand that empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment, and boundaries without empathy are walls. The sweet spot, the power zone, lies in the middle: emotional intelligence rooted in self-respect. And this is where the transformation begins, because once the super empath freezes, they no longer chase validation. They no longer beg to be seen. They realize that being unseen by others doesn't mean they've disappeared. It means they've finally stopped performing for approval. Here's the paradox. When the empath freezes, they stop broadcasting emotional energy. And that silence, that emotional neutrality, is exactly what makes the avoidant, the one who used to run, start to melt. Because energy dynamics always seek balance. The empath's withdrawal forces the avoidance emotional system to confront the void they once created. But that's the next stage of this journey. For now, stay with the freeze, because this moment, this sacred stillness, is where the empath reclaims power. It's where they stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What have I tolerated that hurt me?" It's where the endless giving transforms into grounded awareness. And I want you to really take this in. Freezing doesn't make you cold, it makes you conscious. It's the point where emotional overextension turns into emotional intelligence. The freeze is not your end, it's your awakening. So, if you found yourself in that silence, not knowing whether you've grown colder or wiser, remember this: you are not shutting down, you are powering up. You're learning the difference between peace and pleasing. Because the moment you stop fighting for connection that drains you is the moment you create space for connection that heals you. And that stillness is where your true strength begins. When the super empath freezes, something begins to shift in the emotional atmosphere. Almost imperceptibly at first, the avoidant, who's built their identity on distance and control, starts to feel something unfamiliar discomfort in their own silence. For so long, the dynamic between an empath and an avoidant has followed a predictable pattern. One reaches, the other retreats. One seeks closeness, the other seeks space. But when the empath stops reaching, when that endless flow of understanding and warmth suddenly quiets, the avoidance emotional system begins to destabilize. This isn't punishment. It's physics, emotional physics. Every relationship operates on an energetic loop. One gives, the other receives, one pursues, the other withdraws. The pattern continues until someone disrupts the flow. When the super empath stops feeding that loop, stops chasing, explaining, rescuing, the energy collapses. And that's when the avoidant starts to feel. The avoidant's entire coping strategy is built on avoidance, not of people, but of emotion. It's a self-protection mechanism rooted in early experiences of overwhelm or rejection. Their distance isn't coldness, it's fear disguised as control. Avoidants crave connection, but the intimacy they long for also terrifies them. So they run, not from the person, but from the vulnerability that person evokes. But when the empath freezes, the dynamic they depend on to stay emotionally safe disappears. The empath's silence removes the distraction, and suddenly, the avoidant is left alone with the very thing they've spent a lifetime avoiding themselves. At first, they may not even recognize what's happening. The quiet feels strange, maybe even threatening. There's no one mirroring their emotions, no one soothing the tension, no one holding space for their walls. The absence of emotional pursuit exposes the emptiness behind their independence. It's not freedom anymore, it's isolation. And for the first time, the avoidant begins to feel the ache they've buried under logic and control. This is where the melting begins. It's not a dramatic emotional breakdown. It's subtle, gradual, and deeply unsettling. The avoidant may start thinking about the empath more often. They might scroll through old messages, remember the warmth they once found overwhelming, or even rationalize their detachment. But beneath that logic, something deeper is stirring. The human need for genuine connection. The empath's withdrawal creates emotional contrast. It highlights what once felt ordinary: care, patience, presence, and now feels like oxygen that's suddenly missing from the room. From a psychological standpoint, this is the power of emotional mirror work. When an empath stops responding, they hold up a mirror that forces the avoidant to confront the reflection they've been running from. The avoidant sees the consequences of emotional distance not as rejection, but as emptiness. They begin to sense that their safety, the space they've always defended, isn't safety at all. It's loneliness in disguise. Philosophically, it's the collapse of illusion. The avoidance illusion that control equals peace starts to dissolve. The empath's illusion that love means endurance begins to fade. Both are being dismantled by silence. But what's fascinating is how the shift often begins with the avoidant, the one who seemed the least affected. Their emotional system, once numb, begins to thaw in the presence of absence, because you can only hide from love until love stops waiting at your door. And when that door finally closes, you realize you were never trying to keep others out, you were keeping yourself in. And here's where it becomes powerful. When the empath freezes emotion, they stop carrying the avoidance healing. The responsibility returns to where it belongs. The avoidant, for the first time, has to meet their own pain without a translator. That moment of internal confrontation, uncomfortable as it is, becomes the first step towards self-awareness. The melt, then, is not weakness. It's awakening. It's the recognition that emotional detachment has a cost. The cost of connection, depth, and love. And as that awareness grows, something even more profound happens. The avoidant begins to see the empath not as a source of pressure, but as a symbol of peace. The very stillness that once triggered fear now radiates safety. The avoidant begins to melt, not because the empath demanded it, but because silence revealed truth more powerfully than words ever could. If you've ever been on either side of that dynamic, the one who froze or the one who melted, understand this: emotional power doesn't lie in pursuit. It lies in presence. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Because silence, when grounded in awareness, doesn't push people away. It pulls truth closer. So the next time you find yourself in that stillness, wondering if your quiet means loss, remember this: the absence of your energy might just be the moment someone else finally wakes up to their own. Because when the empath stops chasing, the avoidant stops running, and both finally start to feel. There comes a point in every emotionally complex connection where both people realize that what they've been doing, the chasing, the withdrawing, the over-explaining, the shutting down, isn't working anymore. It's exhausting. It's cyclical. And the truth is, it's not love that keeps it going. It's unconscious fear dressed up as connection. This is where emotional alchemy begins. The moment you stop acting from old patterns and start seeing them for what they are: mirrors. The empath and the avoidant are two sides of the same wound. One fears abandonment, the other fears engulfment. One overextends to stay connected, the other withdraws to stay safe. It looks like opposites, but it's actually a loop, a psychological dance that keeps both people stuck in emotional survival mode. The empath says, if I can love you enough, you'll stay. The avoidant says, if I can stay distant enough, I won't get hurt. Both are protecting something fragile, the belief that they aren't enough as they are. What's fascinating is that neither role is conscious. These patterns are learned responses, wired in through years of experience. The empath's identity forms around emotional responsibility, reading rooms, managing moods, absorbing pain that isn't theirs. The avoidant's identity forms around emotional independence, suppressing need, avoiding vulnerability, controlling exposure to pain. Both strategies make sense. They were adaptive once. They kept you safe. But in adult relationships, they become prisons disguised as protection. And this is where transformation happens. When you stop trying to change the other person and start decoding the emotional script you're both reading from. Emotional alchemy begins with awareness. The moment the empath says, I'm not responsible for your healing, and the avoidant says, my distance doesn't make me safe, everything shifts. The dance ends when both begin to look inward instead of outward. Now, Let's talk about what that shift feels like. For the empath, it's uncomfortable at first. You've built your sense of worth on being needed. You equate love with effort, and silence feels like rejection. So when you stop rescuing, you'll feel the withdrawal, the emptiness where your giving used to be. That's not punishment. That's detox. You're learning to sit with yourself without defining your value through someone else's emotional state. For the avoidant, the discomfort is different but just as real. When the empath stops overfunctioning, your usual space feels less like freedom and more like loneliness. You start to realize that control doesn't create safety. It creates separation, and that separation starts to hurt. It pokes holes in the illusion that independence means immunity. You begin to see that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the bridge back to humanity. Philosophically, this is what I call the collapse of polarity. The empath and the avoidant stop existing as extremes and start integrating what they've been missing. The empath learns to contain. The avoidant learns to connect. The result isn't dependency or detachment. It's balance. Because emotional alchemy isn't about changing who you are. It's about transmuting what you fear into something you can use. The empath transforms their sensitivity into discernment, learning when to feel and when to step back. The avoidant transforms their independence into grounded presence, learning that closeness doesn't erase them, it expands them. When both individuals rise into awareness, the relationship itself begins to evolve from reaction to reflection. Instead of one pursuing and one retreating, you find two people meeting in the middle, not to merge, but to understand. You see, awareness always precedes power. You can't change what you won't see, and you can't heal what you won't name. Emotional alchemy is the process of seeing your emotional reflexes clearly enough to choose something different. It's realizing that you don't have to keep repeating the same story just because it feels familiar. You can rewrite it. You can rewire it. You can consciously decide that love will no longer be a battlefield of fear and longing, but a meeting of self-aware souls. And here's the truth that most people miss: healing doesn't mean the empath becomes less emotional or the avoidant becomes more expressive. Healing means both become real. The empath learns that love without boundaries isn't love, it's self-erasure. The avoidant learns that distance without intimacy isn't strength, it's fear wearing armor. When both begin to own their part in the dynamic, compassion replaces blame and awareness replaces reaction. That's emotional alchemy, turning unconscious pain into conscious power. It's when empathy becomes insight, silence becomes strength, and vulnerability becomes the gateway to genuine connection. So, if you find yourself caught in that cycle, chasing someone who pulls away or running from someone who gets too close, pause. Look at what that moment is trying to teach you, because behind every trigger is truth, and behind every reaction is an invitation to grow. Remember this: love isn't found in control or compliance. It's born in awareness. When you stop reacting and start reflecting, everything changes, not because they finally understand you, but because you finally understand yourself. And that's the moment where pain turns into power, where emotional alchemy begins. There's this point in every connection between an empath and an avoidant where the cycle starts to feel too heavy to carry. The same arguments keep happening, the same silences keep returning, and both people are left wondering why love feels more like survival than peace. It's not because the love is gone. It's because both people are still reacting from fear instead of awareness. And when fear runs the show, love has no room to breathe. What most people don't realize is that every relationship has its own emotional choreography. a dance of pursuit and withdrawal. The empath's instinct is to move closer, to repair, to explain, to reconnect. The avoidance instinct is to pull away, to protect space, to regulate from a distance. Both patterns are understandable. They were born out of different childhood environments, different lessons about safety. The empath learned that closeness brings stability. The avoidant learned that closeness brings chaos. So both are doing the same thing, trying to feel safe. They're just doing it in completely opposite ways. Now here's where emotional alchemy begins. When you step out of that automatic dance long enough to actually see it, you start to understand that neither role is right or wrong. They're just reactive. The empath isn't weak, and the avoidant isn't cold. They're both operating from the nervous system, not the heart. They're both trying to protect themselves from the same core wound, the fear of disconnection. The empath's fear says, if I don't hold on, I'll be left. The avoidance fear says, if I get too close, I'll disappear. Both are terrified of loss, one of love, one of self. The transformation happens when awareness enters the room. Because once you can see your own pattern, you can't unsee it. You start catching yourself mid-reaction. The empath starts to pause before sending that long message, before explaining what doesn't need explaining. The avoidant starts to notice the discomfort that rises when someone gets too close, the urge to retreat. That moment of awareness is everything. It's the first step out of unconscious reaction and into conscious choice. From a psychological standpoint, this is the integration of opposites. Every empath has a hidden avoidant side, a part of them that craves independence, but doesn't know how to claim it without guilt. And every avoidant has an inner empath, a part of them that craves connection, but doesn't know how to trust it without fear. When those parts begin to integrate, you stop being ruled by extremes. You stop swinging between too much and not enough. You learn balance. That's the essence of emotional alchemy. Not destroying one part of you to favor the other, but blending both until you become emotionally whole. For the empath, this shift feels like stepping back into your body. You begin to understand that love doesn't require overextension. You start realizing that silence isn't rejection. Sometimes it's clarity. You begin to regulate from within instead of waiting for reassurance from outside. That's real strength. For the avoidant, this process feels like softening into vulnerability. You start to see that being known doesn't mean being controlled. That letting someone in doesn't mean losing yourself. That you can stay and still be free. Philosophically, this transformation is profound. It's the point where love stops being a battlefield and becomes a mirror, not to reflect blame, but to reveal truth. You see, relationships aren't meant to complete you. They're meant to expose you, to show you where you're still afraid, where you still hide, where you still run. Emotional alchemy is what happens when you use that exposure as fuel for growth instead of evidence for pain. And it's not about perfection. You'll still have triggers. You'll still have moments where you want to pull away or overreach. But the difference is, you'll know what's happening. You'll catch the pattern before it takes control. You'll breathe through the impulse instead of collapsing into it. Awareness doesn't erase your emotions. It gives you the power to channel them. That's the shift from reaction to response, from fear to understanding. When you start relating this way, love stops feeling like a tug of war and starts feeling like a dialogue. You no longer need to prove your worth through effort or defend your freedom through distance. You begin to build connection on a new foundation, one made of accountability, not anxiety, curiosity, not control. And the truth is, This kind of growth doesn't just change your relationships, it changes your relationship with yourself. The empath becomes grounded. The avoidant becomes open. Both learn to meet in the middle, not because one chased or one surrendered, but because both evolved. So if you're stuck in that loop, that cycle of reaching and retreating, this is your invitation to step back and look at the pattern, not the person. The relationship isn't broken, it's revealing. It's showing you what's unhealed, what's unconscious, what's ready to evolve. Remember this: love isn't supposed to drain you or protect you. It's supposed to grow you. And when you stop reacting and start transforming, you don't just change the relationship, you change yourself. There's a moment in every emotional dynamic where the entire energy structure just collapses. It's quiet, almost anticlimactic. There's no argument, no dramatic ending, no tearful conversation, just a shift. A subtle, powerful recalibration in the emotional field. The empath, who once poured their entire being into the connection, suddenly stops trying to keep it alive. They stop explaining, stop apologizing, stop holding emotional space for someone who never met them halfway. It's not rebellion. It's not revenge. It's release. And that moment, that exact point when the super empath's energy reverses polarity, is when everything changes. You see, energy in relationships is circular. There's always an exchange, give and receive, push and pull, reach and retreat. But what happens when one side stops sending energy into the loop? When the empath steps out of the emotional current, the dynamic loses power. What was once an energetic tether suddenly dissolves. It's like pulling the plug on an emotional circuit that's been running on overdrive for too long. The avoidant, who used to rely on the empath's emotional intensity as both comfort and control, is suddenly left in silence. No signals, no pull, no pursuit. That silence is disorienting, because for the avoidant, the empath's emotional energy was the gravity that gave their distance meaning. Without it, the entire pattern falls apart. The avoidant can no longer define themselves through avoidance because there's nothing left to avoid. It's not that the empath has become cold. It's that they've stopped feeding the illusion. And when that illusion breaks, the avoidant's internal defenses start to crumble too. From a psychological perspective, what's really happening here is the withdrawal of emotional supply. The empath was unconsciously sustaining the connection through their emotional labor, managing both people's feelings, anticipating needs, and absorbing rejection as if it were a challenge to heal. When that stops, the dynamic collapses because it was never built on mutual regulation. It was built on one person doing all the emotional heavy lifting. And here's the truth. The empath's freeze is not indifference. It's integration. It's the moment they realize that silence isn't empty. It's full of truth. It's the moment they understand that their energy, their presence, their emotional availability, all of it, has value. And when you recognize your own value, you stop offering it to those who can't hold it. That's when the polarity reverses. The empath's calm becomes magnetic. Their neutrality becomes power. Because stillness, when it's born from self-awareness, carries a frequency that disrupts every old pattern built on imbalance. The avoidant, who once felt secure in their distance, begins to feel the absence as loss. They start to sense what they once suppressed: longing, curiosity, even regret. The dynamic that once protected them from vulnerability now exposes them to it. The silence that used to comfort them now amplifies the truth they've avoided. They miss connection, but they fear it because it requires surrender. And let's be clear. This isn't about playing emotional chess. It's not about silence as strategy or distance as manipulation. It's about energy finding its balance. When the empath withdraws with consciousness, not resentment, the emotional field begins to purify. The noise of over-explaining, over-giving, and over-functioning fades. What's left is pure resonance, truth without distortion. That's when the real healing starts. Philosophically, this moment represents the collapse of attachment illusions, the realization that you can't force closeness through effort, nor sustain love through sacrifice. Love that requires one person to shrink is not love, it's dependency. When the empath steps out of the emotional role they've been unconsciously performing, they return to themselves. And that return is magnetic, not because it draws the avoidant back, but because it realigns the empath with authenticity. Stillness has a way of revealing what chaos hides. When you stop reacting, you start observing. You start seeing who is truly meeting you and who is only comfortable with your effort. You begin to understand that peace isn't passive. It's powerful, because it forces everything and everyone around you to rise to the level of truth. That's the paradox of this reversal. The moment the empath lets go is the same moment the avoidant starts to feel. When the empath stops filling the silence, the avoidant has to face it. And in that silence, both are given the same opportunity to meet themselves. The empath meets their need for boundaries. The avoidant meets their fear of closeness. The energy that once bound them in tension becomes a mirror, reflecting both of their unhealed parts back at them. This collapse isn't destruction, it's transformation. It's not the end of love, it's the end of illusion. When emotional polarity reverses, truth surfaces. What's real remains. What was dependent dissolves. And in that moment, both people are finally free. Not to run from each other, but to see each other clearly, maybe for the first time. So, if you're in that silence right now, that eerie calm where everything feels both over and unfinished, don't mistake it for emptiness. That's the sound of your energy returning home. That's the universe rebalancing what's been uneven for too long. Because sometimes the loudest transformation doesn't happen in chaos, it happens in stillness. And when you stop feeding what drains you, everything that's meant for you finally finds its way back. You said, expand key point 5 into a 700-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Mel Robbins' approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. ChatGPT said, "There's a crucial distinction that almost no one talks about, the difference between emotional safety and emotional strategy. At first glance, they can look identical. Silence, distance, calm detachment, all of these can appear to mean the same thing. But the intention behind them changes everything. Emotional strategy is about control, emotional safety is about peace. And that distinction determines whether your stillness is an act of self-protection or an act of self-respect. Let's be honest, when you've been in a relationship where your feelings were dismissed or constantly invalidated, detaching becomes a survival instinct. You learn to pull back, to stay quiet, to hold your cards close. But here's the problem: if you're freezing or going silent just to provoke a reaction, that's not healing. That's still playing the same emotional game, just from the other side. Strategy might make you feel powerful for a moment, but it still keeps your energy tethered to the very thing you're trying to move on from. It's not liberation, it's a quieter version of dependence. Emotional safety, on the other hand, is entirely different. It's not about silence to punish, it's about silence to preserve. It's not withdrawal to manipulate, it's withdrawal to recalibrate. When you operate from emotional safety, your choices come from awareness, not reaction. You're no longer asking, how can I get them to respond? You're asking, how can I stay at peace regardless of how they respond? That shift from external focus to internal grounding is where real power lies. For the super empath, this shift is a huge turning point. You've spent years measuring your emotional temperature based on someone else's climate. When they were cold, you tried to warm things up. When they were distant, you closed the gap. Emotional safety begins when you stop trying to fix someone else's regulation and start tending to your own. It's the point where you realize that your calm isn't a tactic. It's a sanctuary. And this is where the avoidant begins to truly feel the difference, too. Because they're used to emotional strategy, used to people reacting to their withdrawal, chasing, proving, pleading. But emotional safety doesn't chase. It doesn't demand or guilt or threaten. It just is. It's stable, grounded, and completely unbothered by reaction. And that steadiness is disarming. For someone used to chaos as connection, peace can feel foreign, even uncomfortable. From a psychological perspective, what's happening here is regulation. When you're in emotional strategy mode, your nervous system is still dysregulated. You're either in fight or flight, trying to regain control through silence, over-communication, or emotional distance. But when you reach emotional safety, your system settles. You're no longer waiting for their text, their apology, their approval. You've created safety within yourself, and that stability changes everything about how you show up in love. Philosophically, this transformation represents a deeper maturity, the shift from relational power to personal alignment. Emotional safety isn't passive, it's profoundly active. It's the daily decision to respond from awareness rather than defense. It's choosing to be at peace even when someone else isn't ready to meet you there. It's understanding that your boundary doesn't have to be a wall. It can be a quiet, confident no. And here's the real beauty of it. When you build your foundation on emotional safety, you stop performing. You stop trying to be understood by those who refuse to listen. And you stop explaining your value to people who are committed to misunderstanding it. You start living from authenticity instead of reaction. And authenticity is magnetic. It doesn't need strategy because it naturally attracts alignment. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you shut down or become indifferent. It means you've learned the sacred art of caring without carrying. You can love without losing yourself. You can listen without absorbing. You can stay open without being vulnerable to chaos. That's emotional safety, not detachment from others, but deeper connection with yourself. And when you start living this way, something incredible happens. You begin to trust silence again. You realize that peace isn't boring. It's powerful. That not responding doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've chosen yourself. That you don't need to prove your worth through effort because your energy is now too valuable to spend on proving anything at all. If the empath's journey is one of awakening, this is the part where the awakening becomes embodiment. It's not about knowing what hurts you. It's about no longer participating in what hurts you. It's not about understanding emotional dynamics. It's about mastering your response to them. So if you find yourself in that place, that quiet space after the storm where everything feels still and uncertain, trust it. You're not disappearing. You're stabilizing. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming clear. Because at the end of the day, peace is not something someone else gives you. It's something you decide to keep. And when you stop using silence to get attention and start using it to protect your peace, you stop surviving love and start living it. There's a moment, usually after all the emotional noise has settled, when something inside you clicks. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's just a quiet knowing, a calm clarity that says, I'm done reacting. That's the awakening. It's the point when the super empath, who's spent years moving from emotional intensity to silence, finally steps into something new, neutrality. Not indifference, not apathy, but balance. It's the space where compassion and boundaries finally coexist. Up to this point, everything in the empath-avoidant dynamic has been about motion. Chasing, withdrawing, analyzing, explaining. But awakening isn't movement, it's stillness. It's that inner pause where you stop trying to manage what's outside of you and start mastering what's inside of you. It's when you finally understand that peace doesn't come from fixing someone else's patterns. It comes from healing your own. Here's the truth. When you stop reacting, you start reclaiming. Every emotional reaction you've ever had, every argument, every attempt to make someone understand you, every spiral of overthinking was energy leaving your body. Awakening is the moment that energy returns. You start feeling your own power again, not because you've won or convinced anyone of anything, but because you've remembered who you are without the constant emotional tug of war. From a psychological perspective, this is integration, the merging of emotion and awareness. You're no longer split between empathy and exhaustion, between caring and overextending. You've learned to observe without absorbing. You've realized that understanding someone doesn't mean you have to join them in their chaos. And that's the difference between emotional reactivity and emotional intelligence. One drains you, the other refines you. When this happens, everything around you starts to shift. You communicate differently. You no longer need to prove your love through over-explaining or your worth through over-effort. You stop needing closure from people who benefited from your confusion. And that's powerful, because closure isn't something they give you. It's something you create by accepting the truth as it is. You learn that healing isn't about getting back to who you were before. It's about becoming the version of you that no longer needs to survive the way you used to. For the avoidant, this moment can be disorienting. The energy that used to define the relationship, the empath's emotional availability, is no longer there. The game of distance and pursuit is over. What's left is raw reality. And that reality often awakens something deep in the avoidant too, a recognition that emotional safety isn't found in control or escape, but in connection. But whether they rise to meet that awareness or not, that's no longer the empath's responsibility. The awakening is about self-alignment, not outcome. Philosophically, awakening is where the emotional journey turns into spiritual growth. It's where you stop asking, why did this happen to me? And start asking, what is this teaching me? That question changes everything. Because the moment you start seeing pain as a teacher instead of a punishment, it loses its power to control you. You begin to realize that what you've been calling heartbreak was actually initiation, the process of being stripped down to truth. And that truth is this: you are not meant to carry people through their healing at the expense of your own. You are meant to evolve alongside those who also choose awareness. Awakening means you can love deeply without losing your edges. You can forgive without reopening the wound. You can care without collapsing. It's emotional mastery, the ability to stay centered no matter who stays or who leaves. From the outside, it looks like peace. From the inside, it feels like power. Because you finally understand that silence isn't empty. It's full of energy, direction, and wisdom. You've shifted from emotional reaction to emotional radiance. And that radiance doesn't chase, it attracts. You no longer beg for love. You embody it. And here's what's even more beautiful. When you reach this state, you stop seeing the avoidant as the enemy and start recognizing them as the mirror. They showed you where you were overgiving. They revealed the parts of you that confused effort with worth. They mirrored your unhealed need to be needed. Once you see that, you can thank the experience, release the pain, and move forward, not bitter, but awake. Because awakening isn't about detachment from humanity. It's about returning to yourself as a whole, integrated human being. You realize that peace doesn't mean isolation, it means integrity. It's the moment you start living not from trauma, but from truth. So, if you're in that quiet space now, where you're not chasing, not explaining, not proving, don't rush it. That's not emptiness you're feeling. That's expansion. That's the sound of your soul catching up to its own strength. Because at the end of this journey, it's not about who melted first or who froze last. It's about who woke up. And when you do, you stop waiting to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. And that choice, that single, grounded decision to rise from reaction into radiance, is where freedom begins.